In 1986, Gary Coleman turned 18 and went to collect his $18 million fortune, only to discover his own parents had stolen every single cent. But his family wasn't the only one bleeding him dry. Hollywood weaponized his life-threatening kidney disease to bypass child labor laws, working him to the brink of physical collapse before throwing him away the moment he grew up. He went from being the highest-paid child star on television to a bankrupt mall security guard, handcuffed and humiliated in a cheap polyester uniform. This is the tragic true story of Gary Coleman. The roots of this systematic exploitation began long before the blinding studio lights. The foundation of his television empire was not built on a Hollywood backlot, it was forged in a hospital ward. Born in February 1968, Gary was adopted shortly after by Willie and Sue Coleman, a working-class couple living in Zion, Illinois. Willie operated a forklift, and Sue worked as a nurse practitioner. To the outside world, it appeared to be a standard, quiet Midwestern upbringing. But within the first 2 years of his life, a devastating medical reality emerged that would dictate the entire trajectory of his existence. He was diagnosed with focal segmental glomerulosclerosis, a severe, incurable, and progressive congenital kidney disease. The condition systematically attacks the filtering units of the kidneys, causing protein to leak into the urine and leading to total renal failure. For a toddler, it was a death sentence operating on a delay. To keep him alive, medical professionals were forced to subject his small body to a brutal, relentless regimen of interventions. He underwent his first kidney transplant when he was just 5 years old, an excruciating procedure that his immune system ultimately rejected. The treatment for the disease was almost as punishing as the illness itself. To suppress his immune system and manage the constant internal inflammation, doctors prescribed massive, sustained doses of corticosteroids. These heavy industrial-strength medications kept his remaining organ function from completely collapsing, but they carried catastrophic side effects for a developing child. The steroids fundamentally altered his physiology. They permanently halted his skeletal growth, locking his height at a mere 4 feet 8 inches. Furthermore, the medication caused a specific type of facial swelling, giving him the round, full cheeks typically associated with healthy, well-fed toddlers. This biological tragedy, a source of immense physical agony and psychological trauma for the child, would soon be viewed through a very different lens by the entertainment industry. When he began to show a natural aptitude for public speaking and modeling in local Chicago fashion shows, his parents sought out a talent agent. He was quickly booked for local commercials, his sharp intelligence and adult-like articulation providing a jarring, highly effective contrast to his tiny physical stature. The camera loved him, but it loved a lie. The public looked at the television screen and saw an adorable, precocious little boy. They did not see the dialysis ports. They did not see the exhaustion. They saw the chipmunk cheeks as a sign of cherubic youth, entirely unaware that they were looking at the physical manifestation of heavy, life-saving steroids. By the mid-1970s, the American television industry was undergoing a massive structural shift. The major networks were desperate for situation comedies that could capture broad, family-oriented demographics while touching upon the newly acceptable social issues of the era. Norman Lear had revolutionized the sitcom format with shows that addressed class and race, and rival networks were scrambling to replicate that highly lucrative formula. NBC was developing a program about a wealthy white Manhattan businessman who adopts the 2 black sons of his deceased housekeeper. The premise was designed to be heartwarming, socially progressive, and entirely safe for advertisers. They cast the roles of the older brother and the teenage daughter, but the entire production hinged on finding the perfect child to play the youngest son, Arnold Jackson. When television executives in Los Angeles saw the audition tapes of the young boy from Illinois, the machinery of exploitation clicked into gear. They did not just see a talented child, they saw an unprecedented, highly lucrative industrial loophole. The production of a multi-camera television series is a merciless grind. It requires long hours of table reads, blocking, rehearsals, and filming under intense, sweltering lights. The environment is designed to extract maximum efficiency from adult professionals. Because of the inherent dangers of this environment, the state of California operated under strict child labor laws. These regulations legally mandated that young children could only be kept on a soundstage for a few hours a day, strictly limiting their working hours and requiring mandatory periods of rest and studio schooling. For a television producer, a child actor is an expensive logistical nightmare, a constant race against the clock before the labor inspector shuts down the set. But this boy offered a chilling solution to that problem. Because his disease had permanently frozen his physical development, the network executives realized they had found the holy grail of television casting, an actor who possessed the physical dimensions and visual appeal of a very young child, but the stamina, cognitive development, and crucially, the advancing legal age of an older adolescent. As he aged into his teenage years during the run of the show, he would legally be permitted to work longer, more punishing hours on the set, executing complex comedic timing and memorizing vast amounts of dialogue that a genuine 8-year-old could never manage. Yet on screen, he would remain the perpetual toddler. The studio could bypass the spirit of the child labor laws entirely. They could work him with the intensity of an adult while marketing him as a helpless, adorable child. His life-threatening congenital disease had been successfully weaponized, transformed from a medical tragedy into the ultimate tool for corporate efficiency. In the autumn of 1978, Different Strokes premiered on network television. It was an immediate, explosive success, driven entirely by the undeniable charisma of its youngest star. The ratings skyrocketed, and the money began to flow in unprecedented volumes. The boy from Illinois was instantly transformed from a critically ill pediatric patient into the central pillar of a multi-million-dollar corporate franchise. He was moved to Los Angeles, completely severed from any semblance of a normal life. His mother, the nurse who understood the exact terrifying fragility of his kidneys, and his father, the factory worker, abandoned their previous lives and transitioned into his full-time managers. They stepped into the glittering world of Hollywood, intoxicated by the sudden influx of staggering wealth, leaving the reality of their son's failing biology neatly concealed beneath the bright sweaters and canned laughter of the NBC soundstage. The doors of the golden cage swung shut, and the lock was turned. The audience settled into their living rooms, waiting to laugh, completely blind to the slow-motion destruction that was just beginning. The explosion of Different Strokes onto the cultural landscape in the late 1970s created a financial vortex that consumed everything in its path. The character of Arnold Jackson did not just anchor a television program, he became an independent economy. The catchphrase he delivered with precisely calibrated, wide-eyed timing was printed on lunchboxes, T-shirts, and posters across the globe. By the early 1980s, the boy at the center of this massive corporate enterprise was commanding a salary of $100,000 per week. He was shaking hands with sitting presidents, trading comedic lines with Muhammad Ali, and generating hundreds of millions of dollars in syndication rights for the network. He was the undisputed king of primetime television. Yet the daily existence of the highest-paid child star in the world was defined by unyielding physical torture. The public consumed the polished 22-minute broadcasts of a cheerful child solving mild domestic disputes in a luxury penthouse. They were entirely shielded from the gruesome, terrifying reality of the production process. The boy was not a healthy actor stepping into a role. He was a critically ill patient whose failing body was being forcibly kept in motion by a relentless schedule and heavy medical machinery. The biological trap that had made him so valuable to the studio executives was beginning to close. The kidney transplant he had received at the age of 5 was failing. His internal organs, already severely compromised by the congenital disease, were shutting down under the immense stress of his existence. As the television program reached the absolute zenith of its popularity, his physical health reached its absolute nadir. He was forced to begin dialysis treatments to stay alive. The contrast between his medical reality and his professional obligations was grotesque. Dialysis is not a passive, comfortable procedure. It is an aggressive, exhausting, mechanical intervention. For several hours a day, multiple days a week, his blood was pumped out of his small body, cycled through a machine to filter out the toxins his dead kidneys could no longer process, and then pumped back into his veins. The process leaves adult patients severely depleted, nauseous, shivering, and drained of all physical energy. It is a grueling battle for basic survival. But the NBC television network and the vast apparatus of handlers surrounding him did not view his dialysis as a reason to halt production. They viewed it as a logistical hurdle to be managed. The show was too profitable to pause. A rigid, unforgiving schedule was constructed to accommodate both his life support and his shooting requirements. He would endure the agonizing hours attached to the dialysis machine, his blood physically leaving his body, fighting waves of profound nausea and bone-deep fatigue. Then, instead of being allowed to sleep or recover in a hospital bed, he was disconnected from the machines, driven to the studio lot in Los Angeles, and thrust directly into the machinery of show business. Wardrobe assistants would dress his bruised, exhausted body in brightly colored childish clothing. Makeup artists would cover the pallor of his skin. He was pushed out onto the sound stage, under the blinding heat of the studio lights, and positioned in front of a live audience. When the director called for action, a terrifying psychological switch had to be flipped. The boy who felt as though he was slowly dying inside was legally contracted to project absolute, invulnerable joy. He had to summon an impossible reserve of energy to deliver his lines loudly, to hit his marks perfectly, and to smile with enough wattage to light up millions of living rooms. He was executing complex physical comedy and trading fast-paced dialogue while his internal systems were screaming for rest. The studio executives, the producers, and his parents watched from the sidelines. They provided on-set tutors and medical supervisors, pointing to these accommodations as evidence of their care. But the presence of a nurse on a sound stage does not negate the fundamental cruelty of the arrangement. They were not protecting a child. They were performing routine maintenance on a highly valuable piece of corporate machinery. As long as he could stand up and deliver the catchphrase that kept the advertising revenue flowing, the underlying medical trauma was treated as an acceptable operational cost. His disease was a secret kept hidden behind the canned laughter of the studio audience. This bizarre dual existence entirely stripped him of anything resembling a normal childhood. He possessed the physical dimensions of a little boy, but he carried the financial weight of an entire production company on his narrow shoulders. The adults in his life, the directors, the agents, the publicists, and his own parents were all directly financially dependent on his ability to perform. Every interaction he had was transactional. He quickly realized that the affection and attention he received were entirely conditional. People smiled at him because he was Arnold Jackson, the golden goose. They did not see the exhausted boy bleeding into a dialysis machine. They saw a walking commodity. Trapped in this environment, he developed a fiercely sharp, highly cynical intelligence. He was an adult forced to wear the costume of a child, surrounded by real adults who treated him like a temperamental boss. The cognitive dissonance was staggering. He would sit in boardrooms discussing multi-million-dollar contract negotiations, understanding the exact financial mechanics of his syndication value, and then he would be ordered to go in front of a camera and hold a teddy bear for a promotional photograph. The isolation was absolute. He had no peers. He could not attend a normal school. He could not make friends who did not want to exploit his fame. And he could not walk down a public street without being mobbed by strangers demanding that he perform for them. He retreated inward, finding his only genuine solace in solitary hobbies, like building intricate model train sets. In the miniature worlds he constructed, he had absolute control. The trains ran on the tracks he laid down, a quiet, orderly escape from a reality where his own body and his entire life were entirely controlled by the demands of a television network. The toxic atmosphere of the different strokes set compounded his alienation. The production was a pressure cooker of massive wealth and zero psychological support. While he was battling for his physical life, his teenage co-stars were unraveling under the intense scrutiny of global fame. The environment offered no protection from the predators that orbit Hollywood wealth. He watched the older child actors on the set spiral into substance abuse and dangerous behavior, absorbing the dark, chaotic reality of the industry while being forced to maintain his own pristine, family-friendly image. He was the moral anchor of the show on screen, but off-screen, he was a silent witness to the destruction of his television siblings. He survived the grueling daily torture of the late 1970s and early 1980s through sheer, uncompromising willpower. He endured the needles, the exhaustion, the flashing cameras, and the relentless demands of his parents and producers because he believed in a fundamental contract. He was a highly intelligent young man who understood the value of his labor. He knew he was sacrificing his physical comfort and his youth to the studio, but he firmly believed he was building an impenetrable fortress for his future. As he aged into his late teens during the mid-1980s, the physical toll became increasingly difficult to mask. His face began to mature, carrying the heavy, tired lines of a man who had spent a decade fighting a chronic illness. Yet the producers demanded he continue to play the adorable child. They bound his chest, dressed him in the same juvenile costumes, and forced him to pitch his voice higher. He was actively participating in the humiliation of his own maturing identity, suppressing his natural transition into adulthood to keep the show on the air. He tolerated this final degrading phase of the production because the end was in sight. He was approaching his 18th birthday. In the state of California, the law dictated that the massive fortune he had generated, the millions of dollars in salary, the lucrative syndication points, the merchandising royalties, was supposed to be waiting for him in heavily protected trust accounts. He had done the work. He had bled for the network. He had sacrificed his kidneys for the ratings. He looked toward his legal emancipation with the absolute certainty that his wealth would buy him the independence, the elite medical care, and the privacy he had been denied since childhood. He trusted that the adults who had managed his entire existence, particularly the mother and father who had adopted him, had guarded the vault. The boy, who had been treated as a product for his entire life, was preparing to finally take ownership of himself. On February 8th, 1986, Gary Coleman finally turned 18. For a decade, he had been the human engine powering a multi-million-dollar network. Now, he was legally an adult, ready to claim the $18 million fortune he had bled for. In the eyes of the law, he was no longer a ward of his parents or a heavily regulated child laborer. He was an adult. For years, he had endured the grueling, unyielding physical punishment of the television set and the brutal, exhausting reality of dialysis, with one singular comfort keeping him tethered to sanity. He believed that the astronomical wealth he had generated, a fortune estimated at nearly $18 million, was waiting for him in heavily fortified trust accounts. He believed he had purchased his freedom. He moved to take control of his estate, expecting to interface with accountants and lawyers to begin managing his syndication points, his merchandising royalties, and his massive television salary. Instead, he uncovered a financial crime of staggering, breathtaking proportions. He opened the books on his own life and found a void. The millions of dollars were gone. The public often operates under the assumption that child actors in California are heavily protected by the Coogan Act. Originally passed in the 1930s, this legislation was theoretically designed to safeguard the earnings of minors from predatory parents. But the legal framework surrounding child entertainers in the 1980s contained massive, gaping loopholes, and the people tasked with protecting the young star had navigated those loopholes with clinical precision. Willie and Sue Coleman, alongside their appointed financial advisor, Anita DeThomas, had not simply walked into a bank and emptied a standard savings account. That would have been common theft. What they executed was a highly sophisticated, entirely legal, white-collar extraction. They had established a corporate entity to manage his career, effectively transforming their chronically ill adopted son into a limited company. They then appointed themselves as the primary executives, managers, and salaried employees of that business. Under the guise of career management, they drew massive, recurring paychecks for acting as his booking agents and his financial advisors. They set up lucrative pension plans for themselves, funded entirely by his television residuals. They authorized exorbitant management fees and charged their lavish lifestyle expenses to the corporate account. They purchased luxury real estate, expensive vehicles, and funded a standard of living that rivaled the most elite executives in Hollywood. It was a perfectly documented method of siphoning millions of dollars from a child who was simply too busy enduring life support and memorizing scripts to audit his own parents. By the time he was legally old enough to ask to see the ledgers, the money was not hidden in offshore accounts or complex stock portfolios. It had been legally absorbed by his parents' exorbitant daily expenditures. Out of the roughly $18 million his labor had generated, he was left with a fraction of a percent. The discovery was not merely a financial catastrophe. It was an act of profound, irreversible psychological amputation. For a child, the biological imperative to seek protection from their parents is absolute. For this specific young man, whose survival literally depended on complex, terrifying medical interventions from the time he was a toddler, that reliance was the cornerstone of his reality. His mother and father were the gatekeepers to his medical care, his career, and his interaction with the outside world. To sit in a room with forensic accountants and trace the paper trail, to see the signatures of his own parents authorizing the systematic stripping of his future, required a terrifying recalibration of his entire worldview. He was forced to face the undeniable fact that the protection he thought he was receiving was entirely conditional. It was predicated solely on his ability to generate a six-figure weekly income. The people who had given him a home had viewed him not as a son, but as an extraordinarily lucrative financial asset to be aggressively liquidated. In 1989, he made a decision that formalized the total destruction of his family. He filed a massive civil lawsuit against Willie Coleman, Sue Coleman, and Anita D. Thomas. He dragged the people who had raised him into the harsh, unforgiving light of the Los Angeles court system. The media, entirely ignorant of the profound grief driving the lawsuit, consumed the spectacle with eager, unfeeling enthusiasm. They framed it as a bitter family feud, splashing the details of the missing millions across the front pages of tabloids. The court transcripts from that era expose a devastating reality. Willie and Sue Coleman did not express remorse. They did not attempt to apologize to the son who had sacrificed his failing kidneys for their wealth. Instead, they argued that they were fundamentally entitled to the money. They claimed before a judge that they had sacrificed their own lives, their privacy, and their previous careers to manage his meteoric success. Therefore, they argued, the millions of dollars they had diverted into their own accounts were simply fair, earned compensation for their strenuous labor. They attempted to justify the comprehensive theft by pointing to the unique complexities and intense pressures of managing a child's star with a severe, high-maintenance medical condition. They effectively argued that keeping him alive and working was a service they had provided, and they had billed him accordingly. The court completely rejected their arguments. The judge ruled in the young actor's favor, officially finding his parents and his advisor guilty of misappropriation of funds. He was awarded a judgment of over $1 million, but a legal victory on paper is not a bank transfer. The money had already been spent. After the brutal, drawn-out process of liquidating what few assets remained and paying the exorbitant legal fees required to litigate a case of that magnitude, he walked away with roughly $200,000. It was a statistical rounding error compared to the empire he had built. The lawsuit fundamentally altered his psychological architecture. It destroyed his capacity for trust. From the moment the verdict was read, he lived in a state of permanent defensive hypervigilance. If his own mother and father, the people who had sat by his hospital bed during his kidney transplants, could coldly view him as a business to be dismantled for parts, he could never again trust the motives of anyone who entered his orbit. This profound, isolating alienation fueled the deep bitterness that would characterize his interactions with the world for the rest of his life. He was a young man entirely alone, stranded on an island of his own fame, surrounded by an ocean of predators. Simultaneous with this devastating familial and financial collapse, his professional safety net was abruptly severed. By 1986, the television landscape had shifted. The audience that had eagerly consumed the wholesome, sanitized comedy of the late 1970s was demanding different, more sophisticated programming. The ratings for Different Strokes, once an unstoppable juggernaut, had steadily declined. The network executives looked at the spreadsheets, determined that the character of Arnold Jackson was no longer returning a sufficient profit margin, and unceremoniously canceled the series. For a traditional actor, the end of a long-running television program marks a period of transition. It is an opportunity to rest, to shed a familiar character, and to seek out new, challenging, mature roles. But Coleman wasn't a traditional actor transitioning into adult roles. His stunted growth, the very trait Hollywood had ruthlessly monetized, was now a liability. The industry had demanded he sacrifice his childhood to play a perpetual toddler, and then permanently blacklisted him precisely because he never grew up. He stepped into the highly competitive landscape of the late 1980s carrying an unprecedented level of global fame, only to discover that the industry had already categorized him as entirely unemployable. The mechanics of this rejection were swift and brutally pragmatic. The entertainment industry operates on visual aesthetics, relying heavily on easily identifiable archetypes to cast roles quickly and efficiently. Casting directors looked at the young actor and faced a visual paradox they refused to solve. His face was maturing, carrying the heavy, tired lines and dark circles of a man who had spent 10 years fighting chronic renal failure. Yet his skeletal structure remained permanently frozen at 4 feet 8 inches. He did not fit into any established demographic box. He was far too old and visually exhausted to play a child, and the studios categorically refused to write or cast roles for a man of his stature who was not intended to be a visual gag. He possessed impeccable comedic timing, decades of on-camera experience, and a proven ability to anchor a scene, but none of that mattered. He was entirely typecast, permanently frozen in the public consciousness as the cheek-pinching toddler from a canceled sitcom. He attended auditions and meetings, sitting across from producers who had once desperately clamored for his presence at their network parties. The rejection was uniform. They told him his face was too recognizable. They told him audiences would never be able to separate him from his childhood character. They systematically closed their doors to him, effectively barring him from practicing the only profession he had ever known. The industry had demanded that he sacrifice his physical development to play a child for their profit, and then it abandoned him precisely because he had failed to grow up. This professional excommunication triggered a rapid, catastrophic financial collapse. The narrative often peddled by the tabloid press is that fallen child stars squander their fortunes on excessive partying and frivolous luxury. His reality was far more grim. The fraction of his wealth that he had managed to recover from his parents through the civil courts, a sum that barely eclipsed $200,000, was entirely insufficient to sustain his existence. He was a man with a severe, progressive congenital illness operating outside the protection of a network health insurance policy. The medical bills associated with his failing kidneys were staggering. He required constant, highly specialized care, a pharmacy of immunosuppressants, and regular dialysis treatments merely to stay alive. The money he had fought so bitterly to reclaim evaporated into the accounts of hospitals and pharmaceutical companies. Desperation forced him into a new, deeply degrading relationship with the public. By the early 1990s, the cultural climate had shifted. The earnest, family-friendly tone of the previous decade was replaced by a jagged, cynical irony. Television producers realized there was a new, highly lucrative way to monetize the former child star. They no longer wanted to hire him to act, they wanted to hire him to be a punchline. He was offered guest appearances on sitcoms, late-night talk shows, and cheap reality programs. But the contracts came with a humiliating stipulation. He was required to mock his own legacy. He was paraded onto television sets, not as a respected veteran of the industry, but as a visual stunt. Directors demanded that he repeat his childhood catchphrase, forcing a grown man battling a terminal illness to mimic the high-pitched voice of the toddler he had once been. He was cast in commercials where his small stature and faded fame were the entire joke. He became a living prop for a cynical pop culture that demanded he constantly degrade his own history to earn a living wage. Every time he accepted one of these highly publicized, deeply embarrassing roles, he was auctioning off another piece of his dignity to pay for his next round of dialysis. The catchphrase that had once been a symbol of his immense power became a heavy, suffocating chain around his neck. He could not walk down a street, enter a restaurant, or wait in a doctor's office without strangers shouting the words at him. The public did not view him as a human being. They viewed him as a piece of interactive public property. When they shouted the phrase at him, they were not expressing admiration for an actor. They were demanding that the monkey perform its trick. If he refused to smile or if he expressed the natural exhaustion of a man whose organs were failing, he was immediately branded as bitter, ungrateful, and difficult. The society that had eagerly consumed his childhood felt entirely entitled to consume his misery. By 1999, the arithmetic of his life had reached a brutal conclusion. The sporadic, degrading television cameos could not outpace the crushing weight of his medical debts and his basic living expenses. The man who had once generated more wealth than the executives who employed him was formally forced to file for bankruptcy. The public humiliation was absolute. The financial filings were a matter of public record, eagerly seized upon by the media and broadcast as evidence of his ultimate failure. He had nothing left to sell. Stripped of his wealth, his career, and his physical health, he was driven to the absolute bottom rung of the civilian workforce. To survive, he was forced to take a job working as a private security guard in the Los Angeles area. The transition was visually and psychologically jarring. The bespoke suits and tailored clothing of his network television days were replaced by a cheap, ill-fitting polyester uniform and a plastic badge. He was not hiding in a private office. He was assigned to patrol the floors of a public shopping center placed directly in the crosshairs of the public gaze. It was in this uniform, in the late 1990s, that the pressure cooker of his existence finally ruptured. During a shift at a uniform boutique executing the tedious low-wage duties required to keep himself alive, he was approached by a female customer. She recognized him instantly. Eyewitness accounts and subsequent police reports painted a bleak picture of the interaction. The woman did not approach him with the respect due to a man attempting to earn an honest living. She approached him with the specific entitled cruelty that the public often reserves for fallen celebrities. She demanded an autograph, aggressively mocking his current status and his uniform. She treated him like an exhibit in a cultural zoo, a failed novelty who owed her entertainment. For 30 years, he had swallowed his pride. He had smiled while his parents stole his money. He had smiled while the network worked him into physical collapse. He had smiled while late-night hosts made jokes about his height and his bankruptcy. But cornered in a shopping center by a stranger mocking the absolute ruins of his life, his tightly coiled restraint finally snapped. He struck the woman in the face. The physical altercation was brief, chaotic, and devastating. Security personnel and local police were dispatched to the scene. The former anchor of NBC primetime television was physically restrained, handcuffed, and taken into police custody. The authorities processed him like a common street brawler, entirely blind to the decades of systemic abuse and medical trauma that had led him to that specific breaking point. The resulting police mugshot remains one of the most sobering, indicting images in the history of American pop culture. It was immediately released to the press and broadcast across global news networks. It appeared on the front pages of supermarket tabloids and was dissected on evening news broadcasts. But the media did not frame the incident as the tragic, inevitable culmination of a life defined by industrial exploitation and physical agony. They framed it as a bizarre, darkly comedic footnote. The photograph showed a man in a cheap security shirt, his eyes wide and hollow, carrying the heavy, unmistakable weight of total defeat. The public eagerly consumed the story of the former child star who had fallen so incredibly far that he was brawling with a woman over an autograph in a strip mall. The society that had enabled the theft of his wages, that had laughed at his forced humiliation on television, and that had discarded him the moment his disease became inconvenient, now felt entirely justified in criminalizing him. The mugshot was a permanent brand of failure, a visual confirmation to the world that the golden child of the 1980s was now nothing more than a violent, bankrupt punchline. He was ordered by the court to pay medical bills for the woman he had struck and was forced to attend anger management classes. The profound irony of a court ordering a man whose entire life had been violently dismantled by an industry and his own family to manage his anger was entirely lost on the legal system. He paid the fines, endured the classes, and retreated back into the shadows of a culture that had thoroughly and completely destroyed him. He was a man utterly out of options, waiting in the darkness for the final physical collapse of his body. The dawn of the new millennium offered no resurrection for the man who had once been the most recognizable face on television. He had survived the crushing financial theft executed by his own parents, the brutal professional excommunication by the major studios, and the intense public humiliation of the late 1990s. But survival had come at an insurmountable cost. The California environment that had birthed his immense fame had become a toxic landscape of harassment, tabloid ambushes, and constant reminders of his fractured legacy. In a desperate final bid to reclaim a shred of geographical and psychological autonomy, he packed whatever meager possessions he had left and fled the state entirely. He sought refuge in Santakin, a small, quiet town in Utah. It was a place fundamentally disconnected from the relentless machinery of Los Angeles. The towering mountains and harsh, isolating winters offered a physical barrier between himself and the society that had so thoroughly consumed him. He wanted to disappear. He wanted to tend to his model trains in absolute silence, away from the flashing cameras and the strangers demanding that he perform his childhood catchphrase. But the geographical relocation could not halt the relentless deterioration of his biological infrastructure. The congenital kidney disease that had dictated the terms of his entire life was entering its terminal phase. His body, having been subjected to heavy immunosuppressive steroids since he was a toddler, was entirely exhausted. The daily dialysis treatments were losing their efficacy. He began to suffer from frequent, terrifying seizures. The physical frailty that had once been heavily masked by studio makeup and bright wardrobe choices was now undeniable. He was a man in his late 30s who possessed the skeletal structure of a child and the failing internal organs of a geriatric patient. It was within this deeply vulnerable, isolated environment that he met Shannon Price in 2007. They encountered each other on the set of a low-budget comedy film, one of the few degrading, self-mocking acting jobs he was still forced to accept to pay for his medical care. She was an extra on the set, nearly 2 decades younger than him, and entirely unconnected to his glorious television past. For a brief moment, it appeared he had finally found a companion who saw him as a human being rather than a historical artifact. They married secretly later that year in a small ceremony on a mountaintop in Nevada. However, the sanctuary he hoped to build with her quickly dissolved into chaos. The marriage was extraordinarily volatile, characterized by explosive arguments, interventions by local law enforcement, and mutual restraining orders. The quiet life he had sought in Utah was shattered by domestic disturbances. But the most tragic aspect of this relationship was not its failure. It was how the entertainment industry immediately swooped in to monetize the wreckage. In 2008, the couple appeared on the television program Divorce Court to air their marital grievances before a national audience. For a man who profoundly despised the media and fiercely guarded his privacy, agreeing to have his toxic relationship mediated by a television judge for daytime entertainment was an act of absolute bottom-barrel desperation. He did not participate in the broadcast because he wanted marital advice. He participated because the appearance fee was one of the only ways he could generate the capital necessary to keep his life support treatments funded. The television producers knew he was desperate, and they eagerly exploited his marital crisis for ratings. The audience, still ravenous for his humiliation, tuned in to watch the former network titan argue with his young wife over domestic squabbles. The industry had proven once again that it had no interest in his talent. It only wanted to purchase his suffering. The physical and emotional toll of this relentless public and private chaos finally reached its breaking point in the spring of 2010. On the 26th of May, while in his Utah home, he suffered a catastrophic fall. Given his extreme frailty and the heavily compromised state of his body, the impact was devastating. He sustained a massive epidural hematoma, a severe bleeding between the skull and the brain. He was rushed to the Utah Valley Regional Medical Center in Provo. The medical staff attempted to stabilize him, but his physical reserves were entirely depleted. He had spent 40 years fighting a war against his own genetics and the crushing weight of global fame. He had nothing left to give. He quickly slipped into a deep, irreversible coma and was placed on life support. It is here, in the sterile silence of the intensive care unit, that the absolute pinnacle of his lifelong exploitation occurred. The woman tasked with making his critical medical decisions was Shannon Price. Despite the fact that they had been secretly, legally divorced for nearly 2 years, a fact they had hidden from the public, she still inexplicably retained legal medical power of attorney. On the 28th of May, she made the decision to terminate his life support. But before the ventilators were switched off, before the man was allowed to finally slip away from a world that had tortured him, a final horrifying transaction took place. Photographs were taken of him as he lay dying. He was entirely unconscious, stripped of all autonomy, hooked to a complex array of medical tubing and monitors. These images were not taken by doctors for a private medical file, nor were they captured for a secure family archive. They were actively, deliberately shopped to the highest bidder in the tabloid press. A prominent supermarket tabloid purchased the deathbed photographs for a substantial sum and splashed them across their front pages. The sheer obscenity of this act cannot be overstated. The man who had been sold to the public as a commodity since he was 10 years old was quite literally sold to the media as he drew his final labored breaths. His death was monetized with the exact same ruthless, cold-blooded efficiency as his childhood. The horrifying symmetry of his existence was complete. He had entered the public eye as a highly profitable piece of property, controlled by his adoptive parents, and he exited the world as a highly profitable piece of property, controlled by his ex-wife. He was denied the fundamental human right to die with dignity. The flash of a camera in an intensive care unit ensured that his final moments were packaged, printed, and sold at supermarket checkout aisles across the country. He was pronounced dead at the age of 42. There was no grand cinematic climax to his passing. His heart simply stopped beating in a hospital in Utah, miles away from the roaring crowds and the blinding lights of Los Angeles that had defined his youth. Yet the indignity inflicted upon him did not cease when his monitors flatlined. Even in death, his physical body became the subject of a grotesque, highly publicized legal battle. He had left behind a meticulously drafted will containing explicitly clear instructions. He wanted no funeral. He wanted no memorial service. He wanted no public mourning. He had specifically requested that his body be cremated and his ashes scattered upon train tracks, a final poignant retreat to the only hobby that had ever offered him genuine peace and control. The people who survived him entirely ignored his final wishes. An ugly, protracted legal war immediately erupted over the rights to his remains and the meager, fractured remnants of his estate. On one side was Shannon Price, the ex-wife who had sold his deathbed photos. On the other side were Willie and Sue Coleman, the adoptive parents who had systematically stolen his childhood fortune and whom he had not spoken to in over 2 decades. They fought bitterly in the Utah courts, filing injunctions and demanding control over his corpse, while the lawyers argued in courtrooms, trading accusations and filing paperwork. His physical body lay unburied and uncremated in a morgue for weeks. The man who had been denied ownership of his life was now actively being denied ownership of his death. The people who had exploited him in life were now fighting over the legal right to control his legacy. It was a sickening postscript to a life defined by complete disenfranchisement. When the news of his death officially reached the press, the media reacted with the same superficiality that had characterized their coverage of his entire career. Television networks hastily assembled tribute packages, splicing together clips of his childhood sitcom, while somber voiceovers lamented his tragic end. Commentators and columnists immediately began speaking in hushed, dramatic tones about the different strokes curse. They drew direct, sensationalized links between his premature death, the tragic drug overdose of his former co-star Dana Plato in a motorhome, and the intense legal and criminal struggles of Todd Bridges. They packaged his life as a mystical cautionary tale about the dark magic of Hollywood. But framing the fate of Gary Coleman as a supernatural curse is an act of profound intellectual cowardice. It is a convenient, deliberately crafted narrative device that absolves the system of its direct, measurable responsibility. There was no curse operating on the sound stages of network television in the 1980s. There was only a perfectly functioning, entirely legal corporate ecosystem designed explicitly to extract maximum financial value from vulnerable human assets. The studio executives who oversaw the production did not cast a spell. They weaponized a terminal pediatric illness to bypass state labor laws. His parents were not influenced by dark forces. They executed a sophisticated white-collar theft to fund their own luxury. The public was not under an enchantment. They willingly and eagerly consumed his humiliation when he fell from grace, buying the tabloids that mocked his bankruptcy and purchasing the magazines that displayed his dying body. The industry loves the mythology of a curse because it places the blame on the abstract. It prevents the audience from looking at the men in the boardroom who signed the syndication deals, deposited the advertising checks, and then retired to gated communities entirely insulated from the human wreckage they left behind. The human collateral damage was simply written off as the necessary cost of doing business. His legacy is not a catchphrase. His legacy is a permanent damning indictment of a culture that measures the value of a human life solely by its immediate capacity to entertain. He was a pioneer in a terrifying frontier of modern celebrity, exposing the catastrophic intersection of physical disability, immense wealth, and familial betrayal. He was built into a global titan, systematically robbed of his foundation, placed in a glass cage to be mocked, and left to collapse under his own weight